Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We are fortunate again today to be joined by Dale Humberg and Ken Babcock, our guest in our continuing episodes about the history of waterfowl harvest management. We are now on episode 7, and we're going to pick up with Dale and Ken where we left off last time. But first, I guess, let me welcome Ken and Dale back in. Ken, Dale, welcome.
Great to be here, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
So on our last episode, we made it through the 1960s. Basically, somewhere around that time, we started talking about the point system. That's when we introduced that new type of regulatory alternative. And we're going to have Dr. Jim Dubofsky on a subsequent episode to talk about that in even more detail. But for this episode, we're going to continue on into the 70s. And here eventually over the next couple of episodes, we'll get into, I think with the two of you, we're going to wrap up somewhere around the mid-90s with the introduction of adaptive harvest management. But yeah, on this episode, one of the first things that I guess we need to do, a couple of things. One is after the airing of our first 2 episodes, we got some feedback from at least one of our listeners saying, hey, you guys might need to clarify this particular aspect of something that was discussed. And so that's what we need to do first off. And so specifically what we need to do is go back and clarify something with respect to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I think in one of those first 2 episodes, we referenced how it was amended to include Mexico, Japan, and Russia. And I think maybe the way it came off is if we might have sounded as though Mexico, Japan, and Russia were amended to become part of the original Migratory Bird Treaty with Canada, but that's not exactly right. It was clarified to us, and we apologize for making it sound any different than it is, but the United States subsequently entered into individual treaties with Mexico in 1936, Japan in 1972, and Russia in 1976. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act itself was amended to cover those separate treaties, but we need to clarify that the United States has a series of bilateral treaties with each of 4 nations, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia. And so there are other aspects of that we could discuss, but we're going to forego some of those at this time. But we do appreciate the input that we got from our listeners. And, you know, the one thing that we probably should begin these episodes with is that there are undoubtedly will be a few things that we might not state in their full extent as we go through this. And so we appreciate opportunities to clarify those. And Ken, I think where we want to start off this one is to kind of step back a bit and to touch on something that first came about in the 1960s. And we can just talk about this in generalities, but it's something that continues with us today in a form of, you know, a harvest opportunity that most of us here in the States have, and that is the early teal season. And I think it became experimental in the mid-60s. So if you could touch on what you recall about what led to the desire for a special teal season in early fall and kind of how that came about.
Sure, Mike. As we have discussed before, the early 60s was a period of time when there were fairly restrictive regulations all across North America in terms of ducks, mostly related to the fact that populations were down in response to drought across the breeding areas and lower fall flights. And the people that were responsible for managing ducks and duck harvest at that time were looking for additional opportunities. And the blue-winged teal, being a very early migrant, moving through much of the United States, even prior to the regular season dates that were established, seemed to offer an opportunity for that additional chance to harvest birds without having any impact on populations. So that was the primary thing that drove that. It was established as an experiment, and that experiment went on for 3 years, 65, 66, 67. And then there was a time frame that the season was not offered so that the results of those experimental years could be evaluated, and then in 1970 or the early 70s, it was reinstituted and has basically been carried on and offered as an option to most states since that time.
Thank you for that, Ken. We wanted to go back and just cover that in case any of our listeners have ever wondered when that teal season, early teal season, first came about. There have been a number of changes to the teal season regulations through the years, and we might touch on those as we go forward. But nevertheless, just wanted to at least put a marker, so to speak, on when the teal seasons came about, because that is certainly a part of our regulatory options or our harvest opportunities that we have today. And so they date back to the mid 60s. So now we want to move into the 70s with this conversation. Ken, you were an active participant in the Flyway system at this time. And Dale, remind me, I feel like I ask this every time, but usually a couple of weeks go by between our conversations. When did you take a position in the Flyway system?
Yeah, in the mid-'70s, Mike, I was officially on the Mississippi Flyway technical section beginning in 1977, 78.
Okay, and so Ken would have been an active member of the technical committee at this time in the early 70s. And so, Ken, I'll direct this question to you. Is it fair to say that the 1960s, and certainly as we get into the 1970s, was an era of rapidly increasing interest in trying to apply data to our understanding of the harvest effects on waterfowl population dynamics? Am I kind of getting a feel? Like, we've thought about the effects of harvest for quite some time, as we've talked about, but were the 60s and certainly into the 70s a time when we began to get enough data to sort of evaluate that analytically?
Yes, it was. And, up until that period, the primary lever that we had at our disposal in terms of managing harvest based on what we knew at that time was through regulation, by reducing or increasing bag limits, reducing or increasing season length as being the primary lever. And during that period of time, there were different schools of thought about the impact of harvest. Some people felt that harvest was the primary driver. Other people felt that while harvest may have some impact, there may be other things at play, particularly habitat conditions that were more important. And so the people that were in technical responsibility positions during that time frame wanted to find answers to those questions. So setting up experiments, analyzing available data, doing the things that needed to be done to answer those questions and how they impacted populations and impacted opportunities for hunting certainly became a very important aspect of waterfowl management during that period.
Dale, around the time that you came to the Flyway system, I think I'm going to get this year right, but there was a fairly significant and I guess the actual analytical work would have preceded the year in which you came to the Flyway system. But there was a fairly significant report by a couple of guys named Dave Anderson and Ken Burnham. And that, my reading is that was a pretty influential analysis and report that came out of that. Can you share some of that history? What was the significance of the analyses that Anderson and Burnham undertook?
Well, Mike, the significance of that era was that the work by Dave Anderson and Ken Burnham really set the stage for actively exploring through advanced analytical techniques the whole idea of additive versus compensatory mortality. It put it in a form that biologists using the data at hand could actively test during years that followed. Prior to that, as Ken pointed out, we made an assumption that the gun was the lever that we had, and that a bird taken out of the population during the season was not going to be there next year to lay eggs. And so virtually all of our management was oriented toward this idea that the shotgun was the key element in waterfowl management. What Anderson and Burnham's analytical work exposed was that we've got a couple of different possible alternatives to consider. Additive or compensatory mortality, that perhaps there's some other things going on in the world of waterfowl from the time they leave the wintering grounds till the time they return the next fall that have as much or more perhaps to do with the status of populations, their growth or their decline. And so what it did was accept that we still had work to do with regard to the period of the year when birds weren't harvested, the relative impact of various habitat conditions, harvest pressure, non-hunting mortality on drake birds versus hen birds, that it may not be the same for either sex. And so there was a whole number of things that were introduced at that point in time that caused biologists to begin a couple things. One, being more explicit about what their beliefs were. And secondly, collecting the data to begin informing those beliefs.
So, Dale, do I remember correctly, or do I understand correctly that sort of the key nature of the analysis, or at least one aspect of the analysis by Anderson and Burnham, was to look to see if there was a relationship between harvest rate and annual survival rate, and if we had additive mortality occurring, then as harvest rate increased, annual survival rate would decrease. But if there was some compensation going on, or if there was no effect of harvest on annual survival, then as harvest rate increased, you would either see no change in annual survival rate, or maybe you would see no change up to some point of harvest rate, at which time annual survival rate declines. Was there any definitive outcome from that analysis, that lended more support to one idea versus the other?
I think the key there, Mike, was that it caused enough question marks among people who were pretty certain of additive mortality prior to that point, that began to scratch their heads a little bit and ask about, what would be the processes by which mortality could be compensated for, or the degree to which additivity occurred, and what are the mechanisms that drive it. So I think most important was by the mid to late 1970s, people were asking better and more explicit questions about the process itself and how that related to harvest management.
The analyses that you mentioned there, Dale, and some of the thinking that was going on, some of the discussions and debates led to something, I believe, in the late 70s that was known as the Stabilized Regulations Experiment. Would that be the next appropriate place to go in this conversation with regard to the evolution of our understanding and how we were trying to improve that?
That makes sense, Mike. If we think back to the 1970s, even though we were gaining some additional information, some additional and emerging analytical techniques, there was still a tendency year in and year out to change seasons by 5 days here and there, a bag limit by 1 or 2 birds. And so we were still, in quotes, tinkering with regulations with the belief that those minor changes year in and year out were having an effect on harvest. And so what it brought about was by late 1970s, Canada, and then the following year, the U.S. joined in a process called the Stabilized Regulations Experiment. And what that did was, for a period of 5-6 years, was maintain regulations constant, so that you weren't constantly chasing populations with regulations on an annual basis, and gave you a chance to, over this period of years, learn something when you were not changing regulations on an annual basis.
And so give us a bit more on the Stabilized Regulations Experiment. Now, were they stabilized? I guess they would have to be specific to each flyway, and how much work went into figuring out at what level they would be stabilized? And are we talking about only mallards, or was this across all species where we saw some stabilization?
Yeah, it was across species. Now, recall Canada started the experiment in 1979, and the U.S. followed suit in 1980. After the 1970s, when people were for the most part, pretty satisfied with the seasons that were in place, it made sense to then stabilize seasons at 1979 levels. There were no changes for the most part across species. The flyway differences were retained during that period of time, those 5-year periods, and a whole lot of emphasis then was shifted towards efforts on the breeding grounds. Incredible level of banding occurred not only in the summer but also during the fall and winter, and so it gave us an opportunity. After banding some 35,000 mallards, for example, in spring and summer, and some 30,000 banded in fall and winter, along with radio-equipped birds as well, to look at specific aspects of winter behavior, and there was just any number of things that opportunity introduced. And we learned in a 5-year period some pretty solid biological detail as well as aspects related to harvest management.
Did we come out of the stabilized regulations experiment with having solved all the problems? I know the answer to that is no, but what were the key advancements? And we don't have to go through all of them, but just give us some examples of what we learned. We do an experiment like this, we invest some time and thought into it and collect a lot of data. And I know that we did not arrive at all of the answers, but what were some of the most significant findings to come from that?
Well, even though you were tongue-in-cheek commenting on did we learn everything, of course the answer is no. What it did was better define some of the key questions that we had. Some of the more interesting aspects related to the nature of interval survival. Because we were banding at different times of the year, both males and females, we began to gain insights in the degree to which those mortality rates, the timing of that mortality, differed between males and females. Learned that, for example, the majority of the mortality among female mallards, for example, occurred during the breeding season. They're the ones that, after the male inseminates the female, sits on the territory for a couple of weeks and then boogies off, really has no responsibility and for large part, no exposure to predators. The female, on the other hand, is exposed constantly during that entire 4-week nesting period as well as the brood rearing period. And so a whole lot of the mortality of hens occurs during that time of the year. A lot of it pointed to a relatively low rate of postseason mortality. And so it really helped biologists understand that we need to be thinking about these processes differently between the two sexes of mallards in this example. Ken may have some other insights in that regard, but I think a lot of it was related to our ability to understand, based on banding at different times of the year, when those mortality processes were occurring, and at least by implication, how and why they were occurring. There was some really good work done during the winter that looked at how birds were distributed depending on different habitat conditions, hunting pressure, and the like. And so we gained insights into the non-breeding part of the year that perhaps we hadn't paid much attention to prior to the early 1980s.
Yeah, I would just add to that since the regulations, the season lengths and bag limits were unchanged during this stabilized period, it gave us an opportunity to look at other factors that we knew had an impact on populations, the most important of which we thought was habitat conditions, and be able to start to relate changes in habitat from year to year to changes in populations. It gave us a chance to either confirm or disprove some of the theories that conditions on the breeding ground determined what the productive rate was that year. And it gave us an opportunity to look at things other than just the shotgun in relationship to its effect on duck populations. And Dale pointing out the fact that the difference between sexes of mallards, with most of the mortality occurring outside the hunting season for hens, was a very significant aspect of regulations that followed. And we'll talk about the point system a little later on. And part of that relates to different points for hens versus mallard, versus drakes and the mallards.
Another key point, Mike, I think is that it was during this period of time, because we were looking cross-seasonal, that we really began to ask questions about, well, what's going on during the non-breeding part of the world. It was right after that we had a symposium called Waterfowl in Winter. And so we began to ask questions about the entire annual cycle of birds that perhaps we didn't pay as much attention to prior to that experiment during the early 80s.
So at the end of this stabilized regulations experiment, where did we go with regard to harvest regulations, Dale? The stabilized regulations experiment was in the early 80s, and then we came out of that. And so I guess to frame up your answer to my question about where did we go with regulations after that opportunity to learn, what were our waterfowl populations doing at that time? And then, where did we go from that point forward with regulation? Because it certainly didn't answer all the questions. There were still debates about compensatory versus additive mortality and what the harvest rate should be. But I think there were some key changes to come out of that. So kind of set that up, start with what were our populations doing, and then where did we go with regulations?
Well, Mike, if we recall any recent history with regard to declines in populations, deterioration of habitat, and so on, it was certainly the beginning in the relatively early 1980s, but certainly into 85 through 88 and continuing into the early 90s. The most recent period of pretty severe drought, habitat conditions decline, population decline. And the fact that we just came out of stabilized regulations, I believe, changed the mindset going forward about how frequently we were going to revisit regulations. And so during the period of 1985, 86, 87, we had consistent regulations for that 3-year period. Similarly, 1988, 89, 90, and through 1993, we had relatively consistent regulations. The whole idea that stabilized regulations give us an opportunity to learn about the impact of regulations on populations and so on showed up in the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement in 1988 as a primary theme. And so if nothing else, stab regs and the seasons that followed and the drought and decline populations that followed set the stage for a different way of thinking about waterfowl harvest management through regulations.
Ken, at what time, during what year did you go to the council, the Mississippi Flyway Council? Did you transition away from the technical section and go to the council?
Well, it was not until the mid to late 80s that I actually came back in. I continued to attend Flyway meetings, but I was not actually the council representative until the late 80s through the late 90s. So that was the period of time. But one of the things that I think is important to point out that, having gone decades of convincing people that the shotgun was, it was important to, when populations were down, to restrict regulations. During the stabilized regulations periods that Dale referred to, the population fluctuated just like it always had. In dry years, populations generally were down, and there were individuals, there were organizations that took strong exception of maintaining what they considered to be fairly liberal regulations during a time when the habitat had deteriorated somewhat and duck populations had declined. So we had created a mindset among some people that when duck populations went down, when the prairies were dry, we had to restrict. And so it was, and there were lawsuits filed, there were hearings held, there were a lot of things that went on that was a product of having set that mindset among people interested in waterfowl over several decades.
Ken, there were a couple of other things that happened in the late 80s. Dale has already referenced one of these, a supplemental environmental impact statement. And another we have not yet spoken about is a special session at the North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference. I don't know if that was 88 or 89, but one of those 2 years. And I know you were involved in that, probably had a role in both of those, in some aspect of both of those. So what is an SEIS? What was the significance of the one that occurred in 88? And then also its relationship to the special session at the North American Conference?
Well, the supplemental environmental impact statement that was developed in 87 and 88 basically laid out a new way of thinking about establishing waterfowl regulations. It took the data from the stabilized regulations period. It took the data from decades of harvest and changes in regulations. And it basically said that we're going to be looking at things other than just harvest to determine status of waterfowl populations. And it was that supplemental environmental impact statement that led to the special session that was established by the Wildlife Management Institute as a part of the 1989 North American Wildlife Conference. And that conference, which I had the privilege of co-chairing with Dr. Rollin Sparrow, who at that time was the chief of the Office of Migratory Bird Management, we tried to pull together people who had the expertise in all aspects of what we understood about impacts on populations of waterfowl. And I think that session started the discussion among folks that the supplemental environmental impact statement has challenged us to take a new look at how we regulate harvest of waterfowl, primarily ducks in North America and specifically in the United States in this regard, and challenged us to bring those people together to say, how are we going to respond to this call for a different way of doing business?
Dale, do you recall, you were probably a participant in the special session at the North American. Do you recall some of the significant conversations from that session?
Yeah, Mike, I think notably, and it actually was Ken's presentation that kind of prompted people to take a step back. The primary message there was expectations and reality, because a whole lot of what had occurred the decade or decade and a half prior to that was for people to maybe stop short, beginning with the Anderson and Burnham analyses and other things, to revisit their expectations, and then at the same time to address the reality going forward of how we were going to manage waterfowl populations and their harvests. And so it was a turning point, I believe, driven by certainly some of the analytical advances, the stabilized regulations experiment, and then in the 80s, the declines in populations and the nature of the management response to it. Those things in combination over about a 15-year period resulted in pretty close to a sea change in how we saw harvest management going forward.
Speaking of sea change, Dale and Ken, we can't get out of the 1980s without talking about one of the other most significant developments of that decade, and that being the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. I'm going to get you guys to talk about that, but this is, as you guys have both mentioned, and as I've gleaned from some of my reading, both during my training as well as leading up to this, even during the 1960s and 70s, people were, well, you guys being two of many that were part of these discussions, began to really look to the habitat side of the equation and say, we need to start thinking about it. There's a document that I've come across here recently. I think it was it was the Mississippi Flyway, and the title of it is Lessons from the 60s and Challenges of the 70s in the Mississippi Flyway. And each of you guys probably had some, well, Dale, I don't know if you would have had a role in that. Ken, you probably would have. But I specifically note there were some pieces in that particular publication where it spoke directly about the need to focus on habitat conservation, habitat management, not just on the breeding grounds. It was certainly recognized that that's where the ducks are produced, but even back in the 60s, you were explicitly beginning to identify the need to conserve habitats, and may have even had some habitat goals in some form or another for migration areas, staging areas, and the wintering areas. Ken, I kind of heard you chuckle whenever I mentioned the name of that publication. Does that bring back memories for you?
It certainly does, and it did start to direct consideration to the to the habitat conditions. And one of the things that helped to bring this about that often goes unmentioned is that the pilot biologist that flew the waterfowl surveys in Canada and the prairies of the United States attended a lot of the tech section meetings during that period of time. And I think they brought the importance of habitat, changes in habitat on the breeding areas to the attention. And then those of us who were on migration areas or in wintering areas, that led to discussions about habitat in wintering areas, I think was generated during that period of time. And that what we learned for us is that in the 60s, we spent almost all of our time trying to figure out how to change season length and change bag limits to impact populations, and started to direct our attention to not just that, but what can we do about the habitat situation? Up until that point in time, I think everybody thought, well, they're going to drain all the marshes. They're going to channelize all the rivers. There's not anything we can do about it. It's bigger than the conservation community. But fortunately, there were leaders in the movement at that time that said, no, it's too important to ignore.
Dale, I know you were a critical figure in the discussions and development of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. I want your perspective on the thinking that led to the development of that plan. We're kind of, it doesn't have, harvest management doesn't have a tremendously strong footprint or presence in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It's certainly acknowledged as a critical part of our overall efforts to conserve waterfowl populations. But, and we're going to get back to some of the harvest discussions here in a minute, but I didn't want to go too far without touching on this significant event of the 1980s. But Dale, your perspective on the events leading up to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, whether it be any kind of precursor documents or attempts, and the discussions, whether they were, I'm sure some people were doubted whether we could be effective with this, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
I think it's important to note that from the time that Frederick Lincoln identified flyways, and people began to think about this as an international migratory bird resource with a incredibly broad range of responsibilities, state, federal, flyway. It was something that emerged 70 years ago as a theme that's carried forward to today. Certainly in the late 40s and early 50s even, there were significant efforts to develop management plans. In some instances, they were just species plans. For example, black ducks in the Northeast Atlantic Flyway. Emerging from that, then were things like lessons from the 60s, challenges for the 70s. And that, in many respects, was a management document, a management planning document that carried into the early 80s to the late 1970s, early 1980s. There was a national waterfowl management plan on the U.S. side. But in each instance, people began to ask questions about, now, isn't this broader than just our state, just broader than our flyway, just broader than the U.S.? And that's what gradually led to the really landmark document, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, that laid out habitat objectives, laid out objectives that at least, maybe not explicit objectives, but at least acknowledged that people were important part of this equation as well. It certainly alluded to the role of harvest management. And in fact, it was the North American waterfowl population goals from the 1970s that were the initial basis for a lot of the work on adaptive harvest management that emerged during the early 1990s.
Mike, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another factor related to the North American Waterfowl Plan. Is the case in any major issue related to conservation, there's usually key individuals that are involved. And I don't know who in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made the decision to bring two individuals from the Flyway Council system into play in terms of drafting that North American plan. But these two people were folks that had served both in the technical section, they had served on the councils of their respective flyways, and ultimately became the chief administrator or assistant directors of their respective conservation agencies. One of those individuals was Dick Yancey from the state of Louisiana. Dick Yancey had been one of the people who had said for years that maybe we're putting too much emphasis on harvest in terms of status of duck populations. The other individual was Jack Grebe, who became the director of Colorado. And Jack Grebe was an innovator. He was the one that was involved in the early stages of experimentation with the point system. But these two individuals brought to the table a tremendous amount of respect from people, not just in their flyways, but in the other flyways across the country. And putting those two people in the position of being the primary authors of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan made this thing work. And if I had to pick one thing in my career, the development of that North American plan and the commitment to update it periodically as we continued to learn is probably the most important thing that we have to lean on in terms of managing waterfowl, even still today. And again, Dick Yancey and Jack Grebe were the key players in that.
Dale, anything to add to that?
I think what was notable, Mike, I remember some of the meetings that we had during the early to mid 80s that really hit me was that the broad participation, in addition to those notable individuals, was the participation by others, whether they be from the flyway that you were in, whether they were from Canada. I recall in 1985, the session that we had, that we spent a full day on introducing the North American plan, where it was headed, and so on and so forth. It was hosted, or at least led by, Jim Patterson from Canada. So here we are in the Mississippi Flyway with this guy from Canada coming down, really clarifying and emphasizing the fact that these are migratory bird resources that is going to require a commitment and a responsibility in a much broader way than we might have considered in a flyway management plan, in a national waterfowl management plan. This was, in fact, a migratory bird resource that required participation across all sectors.
And now the North American Waterfowl Management Plan is primarily a habitat plan, but do you recall any of the specific reference to how the plan acknowledged the role of harvest? I kind of mentioned it at the outset here on the NAWMP conversation, but do you recall specifically how harvest might have been referenced in that plan?
I might offer a thought on that, Mike, is this plan was primarily focused on establishing population goals for waterfowl, and it really didn't get into the issue of how you're going to regulate harvest. It left that to the flyways, which I think was appropriate at the time to do that. If it had started to try to direct how harvest was going to be handled, you would have seen resistance from states, from flyway councils, from other organizations. So I think the fact that it was one that said, we want to have these goals in terms of populations, and we'll let the people that direct the harvest responsibilities take care of that. And if we maintain these population goals, the providing opportunities for people to enjoy these, whether they hunt or not, will be met.
Yeah, I think, Mike, it is important to acknowledge that duck harvest management was part of the North American plan. Like Ken said, is right on target, is that it was a habitat plan, first and foremost, a habitat plan. But it also acknowledged that, in fact, if you look at the early document, it basically says recreational duck harvest should be managed through the use of stabilized regulations. And so there was some important thematic elements already established in that if the breeding population index of mallards in the surveyed area of Canada and the U.S. falls below 6.5 million, they were already thinking about changes in harvest management based on these broad aspects, not on year-to-year details of 5 days here or a bird in the bag there, but establishing these overall concepts that would go forward in harvest management. So it was more than an appendix, but it wasn't front and center necessarily in that early document.
And if I could, I'd add one more issue. And I think I've said this before, but my good friend out of the Ducks Unlimited Southern Regional Office, Jerry Holden, used to always say, the answer is money. What's your question? And we found ourselves after the North American plan was approved. We said, okay, we got this great plan, but we don't have any money. We don't have any way to implement it. And there were people like Dr. Gary Meyer out of the state of Tennessee that stepped up through the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and said, we're going to find a way to get this funded. And this plan was approved by the respective nations in 1986. And by 1989, which is a pretty short period of time in the political arena, the North American Wetland Conservation Act had been approved, and the funding that came along with that was also directed towards funding the implementation of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan.
Guys, this is probably an opportune time to wrap up this particular episode. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've moved pretty quickly through the 70s into the 80s. I think this may be the first episode yet where we've actually covered 2 decades. but maybe folks will be reassured to know that there's still some material from the 1970s specific to harvest regulations that we need to cover. So we're going to do that on the next episode. We are going to go back a bit in time here, a bit different from the way we've done some of the previous episodes, but it felt appropriate to move on into the 80s and then talk about the North American plan because that era of the 80s was quite significant in some advancements in the way we're thinking about multiple aspects of the waterfowl conservation enterprise. And of course, what comes after the 80s is the 90s, and that will lead us pretty quickly to a discussion about the emergence of adaptive harvest management in 1995. So we have a couple more things to discuss on a subsequent episode here with Ken and Dale, and we hope you all join us again for that episode. So Ken, Dale, thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
Bet, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Ken Babcock and Dale Humberg, for their continued contribution to this series on harvest management, the history of waterfowl harvest management, and we look forward to having them back on at least one more episode. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work he does on these podcasts. This would not be possible without him. And of course, you, the listener, it wouldn't be possible without you as well. We thank you for your time and support of the podcast, and we thank you most importantly for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.